Chapter 6 of Following the Color Line, An Account of Negro Citizenship in the American Democracy by Ray Stannard Baker. This recording is in the public domain. Part 2. The Negro in the North. Chapter 6 Following the Color Line in the North. Having followed the color line in the South, it is of extraordinary interest and significance to learn how the Negro fares in the North. Is he treated better or worse? Is Boston a more favorable location for him than Atlanta or New Orleans? A comparison of the Southern attitude and the Northern attitude throws a flood of light upon the Negro as a national problem in this country. Most of the perplexing questions in the North pertain to the city, but in the South the great problems are still agricultural. In the South the masses of Negroes live on the land; they are a part of the cotton, sugar, lumber, and turpentine industries. But in the North the Negro is essentially a problem of the great cities. He has taken his place in the babel of the tenements. Already he occupies extensive neighbourhoods like the San Juan Hill district in New York, and Bucktown in Indianapolis, and by virtue of an increasing volume of immigration from the South, he is overflowing his boundaries in all directions, expanding more rapidly, perhaps, than any other single element of urban population. In every important Northern city, a distinct race problem already exists which must, in a few years, assume serious proportions. Country districts and the smaller cities in the North for the most part have no Negro question. A few Negroes are found in almost all localities, but an examination of the statistics of rural counties and of the lesser cities shows that the Negro population is diminishing in some localities, increasing slightly in others. In distinctly agricultural districts in the North, the census exhibits an actual falling off of Negro population of 10% between 1880 and 1900. Cass County in Michigan, which has a famous Negro agricultural colony, one of the few in the North, shows a distinct loss in population. From 1,837 inhabitants in 1880, it dropped to 1,568 in 1900. A few Negro farmers have done well in the North. At Wilberforce, Ohio, I met 2 or 3 who had fine large farms and were prosperous. But the rural population is so small as to be negligible. Negroes of Small Northern Towns. Most of the Negroes in the smaller towns and cities of the North are of the stock which came by way of the Underground Railroad just before the Civil War, or during the period of philanthropic enthusiasm which followed it. They have come to fit naturally into the life of the communities where they live, and no one thinks especially of their colour. There is, indeed, no more a problem with the Negro than with the Greek or Italian. In one community, Lansing, Michigan, with which I have been long familiar, the Negroes are mostly mulattoes, and their numbers have remained practically stationary for 30 years, while the white population has increased rapidly. At present there are only about 500 Negroes in a city of 25,000 people. As a whole, the coloured people of Lansing are peaceful and industrious, a natural part of the wage-working population. Individuals have become highly prosperous and are much respected. A few of the younger generation are idle and worthless. So far as comfortable conditions of life are concerned, where there is little friction or discrimination and a good opportunity for earning a respectable livelihood, I have found no places anywhere which seemed so favourable to Negroes as these smaller towns and cities in the North and West, where the coloured population is not increasing. But the moment there is new immigration from the South, the conditions cease to be utopian, as I shall show. The great cities of the North present a wholly different aspect. The increases of population there are not short of extraordinary. In 1880 Chicago had only 6,480 coloured people. At present, 1908, it has about 45,000, an increase of some 600%. The census of 1900 gives the Negro population of New York as 60,666. It is now, 1908, probably not less than 80,000. Between 1890 and 1900, the Negroes of Philadelphia increased by 59%, while the Caucasians added only 22%, and the growth since 1900 has been even more rapid, the coloured population now exceeding 80,000. It is difficult to realize the significance of these masses of coloured population. The city of Washington today has a greater community of Negroes, some 100,000, than were ever before gathered together in one community in any part of the world, so far as we know. New York and Philadelphia both now probably have as many Negroes as any Southern city, except Washington, if that be called a Southern city. Nor must it be forgotten that about a ninth of the Negro population of the United States is in the North and West. Crowded communities of Negroes in northern latitudes have never before existed anywhere. Northern city conditions, therefore, present unique and interesting problems. I went first to Indianapolis because I had heard so much of the political power of the Negroes there. Afterward I visited Cincinnati, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, and several smaller cities and country neighborhoods. In every large city, both white and coloured people told me that race feeling and discrimination were rapidly increasing, that new and more difficult problems were constantly arising. Generally speaking, the more Negroes, the sharper the expression of prejudice. While the Negroes were an inconsequential part of the population, they passed unnoticed, but with increasing numbers, especially of the lower sort of Negroes and black Negroes, accompanied by competition for the work of the city and active political power, they are inevitably kindling the fires of race feeling. Prejudice has been incited also by echoes of the constant agitation in the South, the hatred-breeding speeches of Tillman and Vardaman, the incendiary and cruel books and plays of Dixon, and by the increased immigration of Southern white people with their strong Southern point of view. Pathetic expectations of the Negro. One finds something unspeakably pathetic in the spectacle of these untold thousands of Negroes who are coming North. To many of them, oppressed within the limitations set up by the South, it is indeed the Promised Land. I shall never forget the wistful eagerness of a Negro I met in Mississippi. He told me he was planning to move to Indianapolis. I asked him why he wanted to leave the South. "They're Jim Crowing us down here too much," he said. "There's no chance for a coloured man who has any self-respect." "But," I said, "do you know that you will be better off when you get to Indianapolis?" "I hear they don't make no difference up there between white folks and coloured, and that a hard working man can get $2 a day. Is that all so?" "Yes, that's pretty nearly so," I said. But as I looked at the fairly comfortable home he lived in, among his own people, I felt somehow that he would not find the Promised Land all that he anticipated. And after that I visited Indianapolis and other cities and saw hundreds of just such eager Negroes after they had reached the Promised Land. Two classes of coloured people came North: the worthless, ignorant, semi-criminal sort who find in the intermittent, high-paid day labor in the North, accompanied by the glittering excitement of city life, just the conditions they love best. 2 or 3 years ago the governor of Arkansas, Jeff Davis, pardoned a Negro criminal on condition that he would go to Boston and stay there. The other class is composed of self-respecting, hard-working people who are really seeking better conditions of life, a better chance for their children. And what do Negroes find when they reach the Promised Land? In the first place, the poorer sort find in Indianapolis the alley home, in New York the deadly tenement. Landowners in Indianapolis have been building long rows of cheap one-story frame tenements in back streets and alleys. The apartments have 2 or 3 rooms each. When new, they are brightly painted and papered, and to many Negroes from the South, accustomed to the primitive cabin, they are beautiful indeed. Even the older buildings are more pretentious, if not really better than anything they have known in the rural South. And how the city life, nearly as free to the coloured man as to the white, stirs their pulses. No people, either black or white, are really free until they feel free. And to many Negroes, the first few weeks in a Northern city give them the first glimpses they have ever had of what they consider to be liberty. A striking illustration of this feeling came to my notice at Columbia, South Carolina. One of the most respected Negro men there, respected by both races, was a prosperous tailor who owned a building on the main street of the city. He was well-to-do, had a family, and his trade came from both races. I heard that he was planning to leave the South, and I went to see him. "Yes," he said, "I am going away. It's getting to be too dangerous for a coloured man down here." It was just after the Atlanta riot. "Where are you going?" I asked. "I think I shall go to Washington," he said. "Why Washington?" "Well, you see, I want to be as near the flag as I can." What the Negro really finds in the Promised Land. But they soon begin to learn things. It is true that the workingman can get high wages, and the domestic servant is paid an amount which astonishes her, but, on the other hand, a fact that somehow never occurs to many of these people, or indeed to the foreigners who come flocking to our shores, the living cost is higher. For his gaudy tenements the landlord extorts exorbitant rentals. Ignorance is ever roundly and mercilessly taxed. I saw a double house built for white people just on the edge of a Negro neighbourhood and held at a rental of $18 a month, but not being able to secure white tenants, the landlord rented to Negroes for $25 a month. When he came North, the Negro, even though he had lived in cities in the South, as many of the immigrants have, never dreamed that it would require such an amount of fuel to keep him through the long Northern winter, or that his bill for lights, water, and everything else would be so high. And in the South many Negro families of the poorer sort are greatly assisted by baskets of food brought from the white man's kitchen and the gift of cast-off clothes and shoes, to say nothing of tobacco and even money, a lingering, loose survival of the relationships of slavery. But in the North the Negro finds himself in an intense industrial atmosphere where relationships are more strictly impersonal and businesslike. What he gets he must pay for. Charity exists on a large scale, as I shall show later, but it is the sharp, inquiring, organized charity of the North. In short, coming North to find a place where he will be treated more like a man and less like a serf, the Negro discovers that he must meet the competitive struggle to which men of the working class are subjected in the highly developed industrial systems of the North. Sufferings of the Northern Negro. In the South the great mass of Negroes have lived with their doors open, fireplaces have kept their homes ventilated, they could leave the matter of sanitation to fresh air and sunshine. And the Negro's very lack of training for such an environment as that of the North causes him untold suffering. To save fuel, and because he loves to be warm and sociable, he and his family and friends crowd into one close room, which is kept at fever temperature, not by a healthful fireplace, but by a tight stove. This, with the lack of proper sanitary conveniences, often becomes a hotbed of disease. Even in mild weather I have been in Negro houses in the North where the air was almost unendurably warm and impure. I know of nothing more tragic than the condition of the swarming newer Negro populations of Northern cities; the more tragic because the Negro is so cheerful and patient about it all. I looked into the statistics closely in several of them, and in no instance does the birth rate keep pace with the death rate. Even allowing for the fact that birth statistics are not very accurately kept in most cities, it is probable that if it were not for the immigration constantly rolling upward from the South, the Negro population in Northern cities would show a falling off. Consumption and the diseases of vice ravage their numbers. One of the ablest Negro physicians I have met, Dr. S. A. Furness, who has practiced among his people in Indianapolis for many years, has made a careful study of conditions. In a paper read before a medical association, Dr. Furness says: "The reports of the Indianapolis Board of Health show that for no month in the last 10 years has the birth rate among Negroes equaled the death rate." Here are the statistics from 1901 to 1905. 1901 332 deaths, 279 births. 1902 329 deaths, 280 births. 1903 448 deaths, 283 births. 1904 399 deaths, 327 births. 1905 443 deaths, 384 births. Race suicide among Negroes. From inquiries that I have made everywhere in the North, there would seem, indeed, to be a tendency to race suicide among Negroes, as among the old American white stock. Especially is this true among the better class Negroes. The ignorant Negro in Southern agricultural districts is exceedingly prolific, but his Northern city brother has comparatively few children. I have saved the record from personal inquiry of perhaps 200 Northern Negro families of the better class. Many have no children at all, many have one or two, and the largest family I found, in Boston, was 7 children. I found one Negro family in the South with 21 children. Industrialism, of course, is not favorable to a large birth rate. All Northern cities show a notable surplus, according to the statistics, of Negro women over Negro men. Many of these are house servants and, like the large class of roving single men who do day labour on the streets and railroads, they are without family ties and have no children. Dr. Furness finds that the deaths of Negroes from tuberculosis constitute over half the total deaths from that cause in the city of Indianapolis, whereas in proportion to Negro population they should constitute only 1/8. His observations upon these startling facts are of great interest. "I believe the reason for these conditions is plain. First of all, it is due to Negroes leaving the country and crowding into the larger cities, especially in the North, where they live in a climate totally different from that with which they have been familiar. They occupy unsanitary homes. They are frequently compelled to labor with insufficient food and clothing, and without proper rest. Of necessity, they follow the hardest and most exposed occupations in order to make a livelihood. I regret to say that intemperance and immorality play a part in making these figures what they are. They easily fall victim to the unusual vices of the city. Another reason for increased mortality is improper medical attention. Not only among the ignorant but among the intelligent we find too much trust put in patent medicines. The belief, latent it is true in many cases, but still existing among the ignorant, in the hoodoo militates against the close following of the doctor's orders. "What shall we do about it?" asks Dr. Furness. "We must urge those around us to more personal cleanliness, insist on a pure home life, and less dissipation and intemperance; to have fewer picnics and save more money for a rainy day. Tell the young people in the South not to come to Northern cities, but to go to the smaller towns of the West, where they can have a fair chance. Unless something is done to change existing conditions, to stop this movement to our Northern cities, to provide proper habitations and surroundings for those who are already here, it will be only a question of time until the problem of the American Negro will reach a solution not at all desirable from our point of view." Of course, a doctor always sees the pathological side of life, and his view is likely to be pessimistic. I saw much of the tragedy of the slum Negroes in the cities of the North, and yet many Negroes have been able to survive, many have learned how to live in towns, and are making a success of their lives, as I shall show more particularly in the next chapter. It must not be forgotten that Negro families in Boston and Philadelphia mostly mulattoes, it is true as well as in Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, have lived and thrived under city conditions for many generations. Not a few Negroes in Indianapolis whose homes I visited are housed better than the average of white families. Sickness among Northern Negroes. Not only is the death rate high in the North, but the Negro is hampered by sickness to a much greater degree than white people. Hospital records in Philadelphia show an excess of Negro patients over whites, according to population, of 125%. About 5,000 Negroes passed through the hospitals of Philadelphia last year, averaging a confinement of 3 weeks each. Mr. Warner, in American Charities, makes sickness the chief cause of poverty among coloured people in New York, Boston, New Haven, and Baltimore. The percentage of sickness was twice or more as high as that of Germans, Irish, or white Americans. Such are the pains of readjustment which the Negroes are having to bear in the North. A question arises whether they can ever become a large factor of the population in Northern latitudes. They are certainly not holding their own in the country or in the smaller cities, and in the large cities they are increasing at present, not by the birth rate, but by constant immigration. Hostile physical conditions of life in the North are not the only difficulties that the Negro has to meet. He thought he left prejudice behind in the South, but he finds it also showing its teeth here in the North. And, as in the South, a wide difference is apparent between the attitude of the best class of white men and the lower class. How Northerners Regard the Negro. One of the first things that struck me when I began studying race conditions in the North was the position of the better class of white people with regard to the Negro. In the South every white man and woman has a vigorous and vital opinion on the race question. You have only to apply the match, the explosion is sure to follow. It is not so in the North. A few of the older people still preserve something of the wartime sentiment for the Negro, but the people one ordinarily meets don't know anything about the Negro, don't discuss him, and don't care about him. In Indianapolis, and indeed in other cities, the only white people I could find who were much interested in the Negroes were a few politicians, mostly of the lower sort, the charity workers, and the police. But that, of course, is equally true of the Russian Jews or the Italians. One of the first white men with whom I talked, at Indianapolis, said to me with some impatience, "There are too many Negroes up here. They hurt the city." Another told me of the increasing presence of Negroes in the parks, on the streets, and in the street cars. He said, "I suppose sooner or later we shall have to adopt some of the restrictions of the South." He said it without heat, but as a sort of tentative conclusion; he hadn't fully made up his mind. Race Prejudice in Boston In Boston, of all places, I expected to find much of the old sentiment. It does exist among some of the older men and women, but I was surprised at the general attitude which I encountered. It was one of hesitation and withdrawal. Summed up, I think the feeling of the better class of people in Boston, and elsewhere in Northern cities, might be thus stated: We have helped the Negro to liberty. We have helped to educate him. We have encouraged him to stand on his own feet. Now let's see what he can do for himself. After all, he must survive or perish by his own efforts. In short, they have cast the bantling on the rocks. Though they still preserve the form of encouraging the Negro, the spirit seems to have fled. Not long ago the Negroes of Boston organized a concert at which Theodore Drury, a coloured musician of really notable accomplishments, was to appear. Aristocratic white people were appealed to and bought a considerable number of tickets. But on the evening of the concert the large block of seats purchased by white people was conspicuously vacant. Northern white people would seem to be more interested in the distant Southern Negro than in the Negro at their doors. Before I take up the cruder and more violent expressions of prejudice on the part of the lower class of white men in the North, I want to show the beginnings of cold shouldering as it exists in varying degrees in Northern cities, and especially in Boston, the old centre of abolitionism. Superficially, at least, the Negro in Boston still enjoys the widest freedom. But after one gets down to real conditions, he finds much complaint and alarm on the part of Negroes over growing restrictions. Boston exercises no discrimination on the street cars, on railroads, or in theatres, or other places of public gathering. The schools are absolutely free. A coloured woman, Miss Maria Baldwin, is the principal of the Agassiz School of Cambridge, attended by 600 white children. I heard her spoken of in the highest terms by the white people. 8 Negro teachers, chosen through the ordinary channels of competitive examination, teach in the public schools. There are Negro policemen, Negro firemen, Negro office holders, fully as many of them as the proportion of Negro population in Boston could warrant. A Negro has served as commander of a white post of the Grand Army. End of Part 1 of Chapter 6. Part 2 of Chapter 6 of Following the Color Line, An Account of Negro Citizenship in the American Democracy, by Ray Stannard Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prosperous Negroes in Boston. Several prosperous Negro businessmen have won a large white patronage. One of the chief merchant tailoring stores of Boston, with a location on Washington Street, which rents for $10,000 a year, is owned by J. H. Lewis. He has been in business many years. He employs both white and Negro workmen and clerks, and he has some of the best white trade in Boston. Not long ago he went to North Carolina and bought the old plantation where his father was a slave, and he even talks of going there to spend his old age. Another Negro, Gilbert H. Harris, conducts the largest wig-making establishment in New England. I visited his place. He employs colored girls and his trade is exclusively white. Another Negro has a school of pharmacy in which all the students are white. Another, George Ham, has a prosperous news and stationery store. A dentist, Dr. Grant, who has a reputation in his profession for a cement which he invented, was formerly in the faculty of the Harvard Dentistry School and now enjoys a good practice among white people. The real estate dealer who has the most extensive business in Cambridge, T. H. Raymond, is a Negro. He employs white clerks and his business is chiefly with white people. 2 or 3 Negro lawyers, Butler Wilson in particular, have many white clients. Dr. Courtney, a coloured physician from the Harvard Medical School, was for a time house physician for the Boston Lying-in Hospital, in which the patients were practically all white, and has now a practice which includes both white and coloured patients. Dr. Courtney has also served on the School Board of Boston, an important elective office. The Negro poet, William Stanley Braithwaite, whose father took a degree at Oxford, England, is a member of the Authors Club of Boston. His poems have appeared in various magazines, he has written a volume of poems, a standard anthology of Elizabethan verse, and he is about to publish a critical study of the works of William Dean Howells. Several of these men meet white people socially, more or less. I give these examples to show the place occupied by the better and older class of Boston Negroes. Most of those I have mentioned are mulattoes, some very light. It shows what intelligent Negroes can do for themselves in a community where there has been little or no prejudice against them. But with crowding new immigration, and incited by all the other causes I have mentioned, these conditions are rapidly changing. A few years ago no hotel or restaurant in Boston refused Negro guests. Now several hotels, restaurants, and especially confectionery stores, will not serve Negroes, even the best of them. The discrimination is not made openly, but a Negro who goes to such places is informed that there are no accommodations, or he is overlooked and otherwise slighted, so that he does not come again. A strong prejudice exists against renting flats and houses in many white neighbourhoods to coloured people. The Negro in Boston, as in other cities, is building up quarters, which he occupies to the increasing exclusion of other classes of people. The great Negro Center is now in the South End, a locality once occupied by some of the most aristocratic families of Boston. And yet, as elsewhere, they struggle for the right to live where they please. A case in point is that of Mrs. Mattie A. McAdoo, an educated coloured woman, almost white, who has travelled abroad and is a woman of refinement. She had a flat in an apartment house among white friends. One of the renters, a Southern woman, finding out that Mrs. McAdoo had colored blood, objected. The landlord refused to cancel Mrs. McAdoo's lease, and the white woman left, but the next year Mrs. McAdoo found that she could not re-rent her apartment. The landlord in this instance was the son of an abolitionist. He said to her, "You know, I have no prejudice against colored people. I will rent you an apartment in the building where I myself live if you want it, but I can't let you into my other buildings because the tenants object." An attempt was even made a year or so ago by a white woman to force Miss Baldwin, the colored school principal to whom I have referred, and who is almost one of the institutions of Boston, to leave Franklin House, where she was living. No one incident, perhaps, awakened Boston to the existence of race prejudice more sharply than this. Churches draw the color line. One would think that the last harbor of prejudice would be the churches, and yet I found strange things in Boston. There are, and have been for a long time, numerous colored churches in Boston, but many Negroes, especially those of the old families, have belonged to the white churches. In the last 2 years, increased Negro attendance, especially at the Episcopal churches, has become a serious problem. A quarter of the congregation of the Church of the Ascension is colored, and the vicar has had to refuse any further colored attendance at the Sunday school. St. Peter's and St. Philip's churches in Cambridge have also been confronted with the color problem. A proposition is now afoot to establish a Negro mission, which shall gradually grow into a separate colored Episcopal church, a movement which causes much bitterness among the colored people. I shall not soon forget the expression of hopelessness in the face of a prominent white church leader as he exclaimed, "What shall we do with these Negroes? I, for one, would like to have them stay. I believe it is in accordance with the doctrine of Christ, but the proportion is growing so large that white people are drifting away from us. Strangers avoid us. Our organization is expensive to keep up, and the Negroes are able to contribute very little in proportion to their numbers. Think about it yourself. What shall we do? If we allow the Negroes to attend freely, it means that, eventually, all the white people will leave, and we shall have a Negro church whether we want it or not." In no other city are there any considerable number of Negroes who attend white churches, except a few Catholic churches. At New Orleans I have seen white and coloured people worshiping together at the cathedrals. White ministers sometimes have spasms of conscience that they are not doing all they should for the Negro. Let me tell 2 significant incidents from Philadelphia. The worst Negro slum in that city is completely surrounded by business houses and the homes of wealthy white people. Within a few blocks of it stand several of the most aristocratic churches of Philadelphia. Miss Bartholomew conducts a neighborhood settlement in the very center of this social bog. Twice during the many years she has been there, white ministers have ventured down from their churches. One of them said he had been troubled by the growing masses of ignorant coloured people. "Can't I do something to help?" Miss Bartholomew was greatly pleased and cheered. "Of course you can," she said heartily. "We're trying to keep some of the Negro children off the streets. There is plenty of opportunity for helping with our boys' and girls' clubs and classes." "Oh, I didn't mean that," said the minister. "I thought, in cases of death in their families, we might offer to read the burial service." And he went away and did not see the humour of it. Another minister made a similar proposition. He wanted to establish a Sunday school for coloured people. He asked Miss Bartholomew anxiously where he could hold it. "Why not in your church in the afternoon?" "Why, we couldn't do that!" he exclaimed. "We should have to air all the cushions afterward." But to return to Boston. A proposition was recently made to organize for coloured people a separate Y.M.C.A., but the white members voted against any such discrimination. Yet a coloured man said to me, hopelessly, "It's only delayed. Next time we shall put off with a separate institution." Colour Line at Harvard. Even at Harvard, where the Negro has always enjoyed exceptional opportunities, conditions are undergoing a marked change. A few years ago a large class of white students voluntarily chose a brilliant Negro student, R. C. Bruce, as valedictorian. But last year a Negro baseball player was the cause of so much discussion and embarrassment to the Athletic Association that there will probably never be another coloured boy on the university teams. The line has already been drawn, indeed, in the medical department. Although a coloured doctor only a few years ago was house physician at the Boston Lying In Hospital, coloured students are no longer admitted to that institution. One of them, Dr. Welker, an Iowa coloured man, cannot secure his degree because he hasn't had 6 obstetrical cases, and he can't get the 6 cases because he isn't admitted with his white classmates to the Lying In Hospital. It is a curious fact that not only the white patients but some Negro patients object to the coloured doctors. In a recent address which has awakened much sharp comment among Boston Negroes, President Eliot of Harvard indicated his sympathy with the general policy of separate education in the South by remarking that if Negro students were in the majority at Harvard, or formed a large proportion of the total number, some separation of the races might follow. And this feeling is growing, notwithstanding the fact that no Negro student has ever disgraced Harvard, and that no students are more orderly or law-abiding than the Negroes. On the other hand, Negro students have frequently made distinguished records for scholarship. Last year one of them, Alain Leroy Locke, who took the course in 3 years, won the first of the 3 Bowdoin Prizes, the most important bestowed at Harvard, for a literary essay, and passed for his degree with a magna cum laude. Since then he has been accepted, after a brilliant competitive examination, for the Rhodes Scholarship from the state of Pennsylvania. Such feeling as that which is developing in the North comes hard, indeed, upon the intelligent, educated, ambitious Negro, especially if he happens to have, as a large proportion of these Negroes do have, no little white blood. Many coloured people in Boston are so white that they cannot be told from white people, yet they are classed as Negroes. Accompanying this change of attitude, this hesitation and withdrawal of the better class of white men, one finds crude sporadic outbreaks on the part of the rougher element of white men, who have merely a different way of expressing themselves. White gangs attack Negroes. In Indianapolis the Negro comes in contact with the "bungaloo gangs," crowds of rough and lawless white boys who set upon Negroes and beat them frightfully, often wholly without provocation. Although no law prevents Negroes from entering any park in Indianapolis, they are practically excluded from at least one of them by the danger of being assaulted by these gangs. The street cars are free in all Northern cities, but the Negro nevertheless sometimes finds it dangerous to ride with white people. Professor R. R. Wright, Jr., himself a Negro, and an acute observer of Negro conditions, tells this personal experience. "I came out in the car from the University of Pennsylvania one evening in May about 8 o'clock. Just as the car turned off 27th to Lombard Street, a crowd of about 100 little white boys from 6 to about 14 years of age attacked it. The car was crowded, but there were only about a dozen Negroes on it, about half of them women. The mob of boys got control of the car by pulling off the trolley. They threw stones into the car, and finally some of them boarded the car and began to beat the Negroes with sticks, shouting as they did so, "Kill the nigger! Lynch him! Hit that nigger!" etc. This all happened in Philadelphia. Doubtless these urchins had been reading in the daily papers the cry, "Kill the Negro," and they were trying to carry out the injunction. While I was in Indianapolis, a clash of enough importance to be reported in the newspapers occurred between the races on a street car, and in New York, in the San Juan Hill district, one Sunday evening I saw an incident which illustrates the almost instinctive race antagonism which exists in the Northern cities. The street was crowded. Several Negro boys were playing on the pavement. Stones were thrown. Instantly several white boys sided together and began to advance on the Negroes. In less time than it takes to tell it 30 or 40 white boys and young men were chasing the Negroes down the street. At the next corner the Negroes were joined by dozens of their own race. Stones and sticks began to fly everywhere, and if it hadn't been for the prompt action of 2 policemen, there would have been a riot similar to those which have occurred not once but many times in New York City during the past 2 years. Of course, these instances are exceptional, but none the less significant. Bumptiousness as a cause of hatred. Some of the disturbances grow out of a characteristic of a certain sort of Negro, the expression of which seems to stir the deepest animosity in the city white boy. And that is the bumptiousness, the airiness of the half-ignorant young Negro who, feeling that he has rights, wants to be occupied constantly in using them. He mistakes liberty for license. Although few in numbers among thousands of quiet coloured people, he makes a large showing. In the South they call him the smart Negro, and an almost irresistible instinct exists among white boys of a certain class to take him down. I remember walking in Indianapolis with an educated Northern white man. We met a young Negro immaculately dressed. His hat band was blue and white. His shoes were patent leather with white tops. He wore a flowered waistcoat, and his tread as he walked was something to see. "Do you know," said my companion, "I never see that young fellow without wanting to step up and knock his head off. I know something about him. He is absolutely worthless. He does no work, but lives on the wages of a hard-working coloured woman and spends all he can get on his clothes. I know the instinct is childish, but I am just telling you how I feel. I'm not sure it is a racial prejudice. I presume I should feel much the same way toward a Frenchman if he did the same thing. And somehow I can't help believing that a good thrashing would improve that boy's character." I'm telling this incident just as it happened, to show a sidelight on one of the manifestations of the growing prejudice. One more illustration. Miss Eaton conducts a social settlement for Negroes in Boston. One day a teacher said to one of the little Negro boys in her class, "Please pick up my handkerchief." The boy did not stir. She again requested him to pick up the handkerchief. Then she asked him why he refused. "The days of slavery are over," he said. Now this spirit is not common, but it exists, and it injures the Negro people out of all proportions to its real seriousness. In certain towns in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, on the borders of the Old South, the feeling has reached a stage still more acute. At Springfield, Ohio, two race riots have occurred, in the first of which a Negro was lynched, and in the second many Negroes were driven out of town and a row of coloured tenements was burned. There are counties and towns where no Negro is permitted to stop overnight. At Syracuse, Ohio, Lawrenceburg, Elwood, and Salem, Indiana, for example, Negroes have not been permitted to live for years. If a Negro appears, he is warned of conditions, and if he does not leave immediately, he is visited by a crowd of boys and men and forced to leave. A farmer who lives within a few miles of Indianapolis told me of a meeting held only a short time ago by 35 farmers in his neighborhood, in which an agreement was passed to hire no Negroes, nor to permit Negroes to live anywhere in the region. Story of a Northern Race Riot. I stopped at Greensburg, Indiana, on my way east, and found there a remarkable illustration showing just how feeling arises in the North. Greensburg is a comfortable, well-to-do, conservative, church-going old town in eastern Indiana. Many of the residents are retired farmers. The population of 7,000 is mostly of pure American stock, largely of Northern origin. And yet last April this quiet old town was shaken by a race riot. I made careful inquiries as to conditions there, and I was amazed to discover how closely this small disturbance paralleled the greater riot at Atlanta, which I have already written about. Negroes had lived in Greensburg for many years, a group of self-respecting, decent, prosperous men and women. They were known to and highly regarded by their white neighbors. One of them, named Brooks, owned a barber shop and was janitor for the Presbyterian Church and for one of the banks. Another, George W. Edwards, whom I met, has been for years an employee in the Garland Mills. "There isn't a better citizen in town than Edwards," a white lawyer told me. And I heard the same thing from other white men. Another Negro, George Guess, is an engineer at the electric light plant. Of the local Negro boys, Robert Lewis, the first coloured graduate of the local schools, is now teaching engineering at Hampton Institute. Oscar Langston, another Negro boy, is a dentist in Indianapolis. These and other Negroes live in good homes, support a church, and have a respectable society of their own. I found just such a body of good coloured people in Atlanta. Well, progress brought an electric railroad to Greensburg. To work on this and on improvements made by the railroad hundreds of laborers were required, and they were Negroes of the ignorant, wandering, unlooked-after sort so common in similar occupations in the South. When the work was finished, a considerable number of them remained in Greensburg. Now Greensburg, like other American cities, was governed by a mayor who was a good fellow, and who depended on two influences to elect him: party loyalty and the saloon vote. He allowed a Negro dive to exist in one part of the town, where the idle and worthless Negroes congregated, where a murder was committed about a year before the riot. Exactly like Decatur Street in Atlanta. A rotten spot always causes trouble sooner or later. Good citizens protested and objected, to no purpose. They even organized a Good Citizenship League, the purpose of which was to secure a better enforcement of law. But the saloon interests were strong and wanted to sell whiskey and beer to the Negroes, and the city authorities were complacent. "Who cares," one of them asked, "about a few worthless Negroes?" But in a democracy people must care for one another. A Negro Crime in the North One day last April a Negro laborer who had been working for Mrs. Sefton, a highly respected widow who lived alone, appeared in the house in broad daylight and criminally assaulted her. His name was John Green, a Kentucky Negro. He was not only ignorant but half-witted. He had already committed a burglary and had not been punished. He was easily caught, convicted, and sentenced. But the town was angry. On April 30th a crowd of men and boys gathered, beat 2 or 3 Negroes, and drove many out of town. They never thought of mobbing the city officials who had allowed the Negro dives to exist. And, as in Atlanta, the decent Negroes suffered with the criminals. A crowd broke windows in the home of George Edwards and threatened other respectable coloured men. As in Atlanta, the better white people were horrified and scandalized. But, as in Atlanta, the white men who made up the mob went unpunished, though Atlanta did mildly discipline a few rioters. As in Atlanta, the newspaper reports that were sent out made no distinction between the different sorts of Negroes. The entire Negro population of Greensburg was blamed for the crime of a signal, ignorant, and neglected man. I have several different newspaper reports of the affair from outside papers, and nearly all indicate in the headlines that all the Negroes in Greensburg were concerned in the riot, and were driven out of town, which was not, of course, true. As a matter of fact, the respectable Negroes are still living in Greensburg on friendly terms with the white people. Human Nature, North and South In fact, the more I see of conditions North and South, the more I see that human nature north of Mason and Dixon's line is not different from human nature south of the line. Different degrees of prejudice, it is true, are apparent in the two sections. In the South the social and political prejudice, the natural result of the memories of slavery and Reconstruction, of the greater mass of Negro population and of the backward economic development, is stronger. In the North, on the other hand, comparatively little social and political prejudice is apparent. But the Negro has a hard fight to get anything but the most subservient place in the economic machine. Over and over again, while I was in the South, I heard remarks like this: "Down here we make the Negro keep his place socially, but in the North you won't let him work." This leads me to one of the most important phases of race relationship in the North. That is, the economic struggle of the Negro, suddenly thrown, as he has been, into the swift-moving, competitive conditions of Northern cities. Does he or can he survive? Do the masses of Negroes now coming North realize their ambitions? Is it true that the North will not let the Negro work? These questions must, perforce, be discussed in another chapter. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Following the Color Line, An Account of Negro Citizenship in the American Democracy, by Ray Stannard Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 The Negro's Struggle for Survival in Northern Cities. One of the questions I asked of Negroes whom I met both North and South was this: "What is your chief cause of complaint?" In the South, the first answer nearly always referred to the Jim Crow cars or the Jim Crow railroad stations. After that, the complaint was of political disfranchisement, the difficulty of getting justice in the courts, the lack of good school facilities, and in some localities of the danger of actual physical violence. But in the North the first answer invariably referred to working conditions. "The Negro isn't given a fair opportunity to get employment. He is discriminated against because he is coloured." Professor Kelly Miller, one of the acutest of Negro writers, has said: "The Negro, in the North, is compelled to loiter around the edges of industry." Southern white men are fond of meeting Northern criticism of Southern treatment of the Negro with the response: "But the North closes the doors of industrial opportunity to the Negro." And yet, in spite of this complaint of conditions in the North, one who looks southward can almost see the army of Negroes gathering from out of the cities, villages, and farms, bringing nothing with them but a buoyant hope in a distant freedom, but tramping always northward. And they come not alone from the Old South, but from the West Indies, where the coloured population looks wistfully toward the heralded opportunities of America. A few are even coming from South Africa and South America. In New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, thousands of such foreign Negroes know nothing of American traditions. Some of them do not even speak the English language. And why do they come if their difficulties are so great? Is it true that there is no chance for them in industry? Are they better or worse off in the North than in the South? In the first place, in most of the smaller Northern cities where the Negro population is not increasing rapidly, discrimination is hardly noticeable. Negroes enter the trades, find places in the shops, or even follow competitive business callings, and still maintain friendly relationships with the white people. But the small towns are not typical of the new race conditions in the North. The situation in the greater centers of population, where Negro immigration is increasing largely, is decidedly different. As I travelled in the North, I heard many stories of the difficulties which the coloured man had to meet in getting employment. Of course, as a Negro said to me, "There are always places for the coloured man at the bottom." He can always get work at unskilled manual labour, or personal or domestic service, in other words, at menial employment. He has had that in plenty in the South. But what he seeks as he becomes educated is an opportunity for better grades of employment. He wants to rise. It is not, then, his complaint that he cannot get work in the North, but that he is limited in his opportunities to rise, to get positions which his capabilities, if it were not for his colour, would entitle him to. He is looking for a place where he will be judged at his worth as a man, not as a Negro. This he came to the North to find, and he meets difficulties of which he had not dreamed in the South. At Indianapolis I found a great discussion going on over what to do with a large number of idle young coloured people, some of whom had been through the public schools, but who could not, apparently, find any work to do. As an able coloured man said to me, "What shall we do? Here are our young people educated in the schools, capable of doing good work in many occupations where skill and intelligence are required, and yet with few opportunities opening for them. They don't want to dig ditches or become porters or valets any more than intelligent white boys. They are human. The result is that some of them drop back into idle discouragement, or worse." In New York I had a talk with William L. Bulkley, the coloured principal of Public School No. 80, attended chiefly by coloured children, who told me of the great difficulties and discouragements which confronted the Negro boy who wanted to earn his living. He relates this story: "I received a communication the other day from an electric company, stating that they could use some bright, clean, industrious boys in their business, starting them at so much a week and aiding them to learn the business. I suspected that they did not comprehend colored boys under the generic term "boys," but thought to try. So I wrote asking if they would give employment to a colored boy who could answer to the qualifications stated. The next mail brought the expected reply that no colored boy, however promising, was wanted. I heaved a sigh and went on. The saddest thing that faces me in my work is the small opportunity for a colored boy or girl to find proper employment. A boy comes to my office and asks for his working papers. He may be well up in the school, possibly with graduation only a few months off. I question him somewhat as follows. "Well, my boy, you want to go to work, do you? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to be a door boy, sir." "Well, you will get $2.50 or $3 a week. But after a while that will not be enough. What then?" After a moment's pause he will reply, "I should like to be an office boy." "Well, what next?" A moment's silence, and "I should try to get a position as bell boy." "Well, then, what next?" A rather contemplative mood, and then, "I should like to climb to the position of head bell boy." He has now arrived at the top. Further than this he sees no hope. He must face the bald fact that he must enter business as a boy and wind up as a boy. And yet, in spite of these difficulties, Negroes come North every year in increasing numbers, they find living expensive, they suffer an unusual amount of sickness and death, they meet more prejudice than they expected to meet, and yet they keep coming. Much as Negroes complain of the hardship of Northern conditions, and though they are sometimes pitifully homesick for the old life in the South, I have yet to find one who wanted to go back, unless he had accumulated enough money to buy land. "Why do they come?" I asked a Negro minister in Philadelphia. "Well, they're treated more like men up here in the North," he said. "That's the secret of it. There's prejudice here, too, but the color line isn't drawn in their faces at every turn as it is in the South. It all gets back to a question of manhood." In the North, prejudice is more purely economic than it is in the South, an incident of industrial competition. In the South, the Negro still has the field of manual labor largely to himself. He is unsharpened by competition. But when he reaches the Northern city, he not only finds the work different and more highly organized and specialized, but he finds that he must meet the fierce competition of half a dozen eager, struggling, ambitious groups of foreigners who are willing and able to work long hours at low pay in order to get a foothold. He has to meet often for the first time the Italian, the Russian Jew, the Slav, to say nothing of the white American laborer. He finds the pace set by competitive industry immensely harder than in most parts of the South. No life in the world, perhaps, requires as much in brain and muscle of all classes of men as that of the vast Northern cities in the United States. I have talked with many coloured workmen, and I am convinced that not a few of them fail, not because of their colour nor because they are lazy. Negroes in the North are of the most part hard workers, they must be, else they starve or freeze, but for simple lack of speed and skill. They haven't learned to keep the pace set by the white man. A contractor in New York who employs large numbers of men said to me, "It isn't colour so much as plain efficiency. I haven't any sentiment in the matter at all. It's business. As a general rule, the ordinary coloured man can't do as much work nor do it as well as the ordinary white man. The result is, I don't take coloured men when I can get white men. Yet I have several coloured men who have been with me for years, and I wouldn't part with them for any white man I know. In the same way, I would rather employ Italians than Russian Jews. They're stronger workers. Not unnaturally, the Negro charges these competitive difficulties which he has to meet in the North, as he has been accustomed to do in the South, to the white man. He calls it colour prejudice, when, as a matter of fact, it is often only the cold business-like requirement of an industrial life which demands tremendous efficiency, which in many lines of activity has little more feeling than a machine, that is willing to use Italians or Japanese or Chinese or Negroes or Hindus or any other people on the face of the earth. On the other hand, no doubt exists that many labor unions, especially in the skilled trades, are hostile to Negroes, even though they may have no rules against their admission. I heard the experience of an expert Negro locomotive engineer named Burns, who had a run out of Indianapolis to the South. Though he was much in favor with the company, and indeed with many trainmen who knew him personally, the general feeling was so strong that by soaping the tracks, injuring his engine, and in other ways making his work difficult and dangerous, he was finally forced to abandon his run. If there were space, I could give many accounts of strikes against the employment of Negroes. The feeling among union labor men has undoubtedly been growing more intense in the last few years, owing to the common use of Negroes as strike breakers. With a few thousand Negroes, the employers broke the great stockyard strike in Chicago in 1904, and the Teamsters strike in the following year. Color prejudice is used like any other weapon for strengthening the monopoly of the labor union. I know several unions which are practically monopolistic corporations into which any outsider, white, yellow, or black, penetrates with the greatest difficulty. Such closely organized unions keep the Negroes out in the South exactly as they do in the North. A Negro tile setter, steam fitter, or plumber can no more get into a union in Atlanta than in New York. Of course, these unions, like any other closely organized group of men, employ every weapon to further their cause. They use prejudice as a competitive fighting weapon, they seize upon the color of the Negro, or the pigtail and curious habits of the Chinaman, or the low living standard of the Hindu, to fight competition and protect them in their labor monopoly. And yet, although I expected to find the Negro wholly ostracized by union labor, I discovered that where the Negro becomes numerous or skillful enough, he, like the Italian or the Russian Jew, begins to force his way into the unions. The very first Negro carpenter I chanced to meet in the North, from whom I had expected a complaint of discrimination, said to me, "I'm all right. I'm a member of the union and get union wages." And I found after inquiry that there are a few Negroes in most of the unions of skilled workers, carpenters, masons, iron workers, even in the exclusive typographical union and in the railroad organizations, a few here and there, mostly mulattoes. They have got in just as the Italians get in, not because they are wanted or because they are liked, but because by being prepared, skilled, and energetic, the unions have had to take them in as a matter of self-protection. In the South the Negro is more readily accepted as a carpenter, blacksmith, or bricklayer than in the North, not because he is more highly regarded, but because, unlike the North, the South has almost no other labor supply. In several great industries, North and South, indeed, the Negro is as much a part of labor unionism as the white man. Thousands of Negroes are members of the United Mine Workers, John Mitchell's great organization, and they stand on an exact industrial equality with the whites. Other thousands are in the Cigar Makers Union, where, by virtue of economic pressure, they have forced recognition. Indeed, in the North, in spite of the complaint of discrimination, I found Negroes working and making a good living in all sorts of industries, union or no union. A considerable number of Negro firemen have good positions in New York. A contracting Negro plumber in Indianapolis, who uses coloured help, has been able to maintain himself not only against white competition, but against the opposition of organized white labor. I know of Negro paper hangers and painters, not union men, but making a living at their trade and gradually getting hold. A good many Negro printers, pressmen, and the like are now found in Negro offices. Over 200 newspapers and magazines are published by Negroes in this country, who are getting their training. I know of several girls, all mulattoes, who occupy responsible positions in offices in New York and Chicago. Not a few coloured nurses, seamstresses, and milliners have found places in the life of the North which they seem capable of holding. It is not easy for them to make progress. Each coloured man who takes a step ahead must prove, for his race, that a coloured man can, after all, do his special work as well as a white man. The presumption is always against him. Here is a little newspaper account of a successful skilled pattern maker in Chicago. A few days ago a large box containing 21 large and small patterns was shipped to the Jamestown Exhibition by the McGuire Car Company of Paris, Illinois, one of the largest car companies in the West. Before the box was shipped, scores of newspapermen, engineers, and business men were permitted to inspect what is said to be the most complete and most valuable exhibit of the kind ever sent to an exhibition in this country. The contents of this precious box is entirely the work of a coloured man named George A. Harrison. Mr. Harrison is one of the highest salaried men on the payroll of the company. He makes all the patterns for all of the steel, brass, and iron castings for every kind of car made by this company. He graduated at the head of his class of 60 members in a pattern making establishment in Chicago. Cases of this sort are exceptional among the vast masses of untrained Negro population in the cities, and yet it shows what can be done, and the very possibility of such advancement encourages Negroes to come North. Trades which Negroes dominate. So much for the higher branches of industry. In some of the less skilled occupations, on the other hand, the Negro is not only getting hold, but actually becoming dominant. The asphalt workers are nearly all coloured. In New York they have a strong union, and although part of the membership is white, chiefly Italian, the chosen representative who sits with the Central Federated Union of the city is James H. Wallace, a coloured man. In Indianapolis I found that the hod carriers industry was almost wholly in the hands of Negroes who have a strong union, with a large strike fund put aside. So successful have they been that they now propose erecting a building of their own as a clubhouse. Although there are white men in the union, the officers are all coloured. Not long ago some of the coloured members began to "rush" a white man at his work. It was reported to the union and hotly discussed. The coloured members finally decided that there should be no discrimination against white men, and fined one of the Negro offenders for his conduct. He couldn't pay and had to leave town. Where the Negro workman gets a foothold in the North, he often does very well indeed. R. R. Wright, Jr. calls attention to conditions in the Midvale Steel Company, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, employer of Negro labor in Philadelphia. Charles J. Harrah, the president of this company, said before the United States Industrial Commission in 1900: "We have fully 800 or 1,000 coloured men. The balance are Americans, Irish, and Germans. The coloured labour we have is excellent. They are lusty fellows. We have some with shoulders twice as broad as mine, and with chests twice as deep as mine. The men come up here ignorant and untutored. We teach them the benefit of discipline. We teach the coloured man the benefit of thrift, and coax him to open a bank account, and he generally does it, and in a short time has money in it, and nothing can stop him from adding money to that bank account. We have no coloured men who drink." Asked as to the friction between the white and black workmen, Mr. Harrah replied: "Not a bit of it. They work cheek by jowl with Irish, and when the Irishman has a festivity at home he has coloured men invited. We did it with trepidation. We introduced one man at first to sweep up the yard, and we noticed that the Irish and Germans looked at him askance. Then we put in another. Then we put them in the boiler room, and then we got them in the open hearth and in the forge, and gradually we got them everywhere. They are intelligent and docile, and when they come in as labourers, unskilled, they gradually become skilled, and in the course of time we will make excellent foremen out of them." Mr. Harrah added that there was absolutely no difference in wages of Negroes and whites in the same grade of work. I have pointed out especially in my last article how and where prejudice was growing in Northern cities, as it certainly is. On the other hand, where one gets down under the surface, there are to be found many counteracting influences, those quiet, constructive forces which, not being sensational or threatening, attract too little attention. Northern people are able to help Negroes where Southern people are deterred by the intensity of social prejudice, for in most places in the South the teaching of Negroes still means social ostracism. Help for Negroes in the North. Settlement work, in one form or another, has been instituted in most Northern cities, centres of enlightenment and hope. I have visited a number of these settlements, and have seen their work. They are doing much, especially in giving a moral tone to a slum community. They help to keep the children off the streets by means of clubs and classes. They open the avenues of sympathy between the busy upper world and the struggling lower world. Such is the work of Miss Bartholomew, Miss Hancock, Miss Wharton in Philadelphia, Miss Eaton in Boston, Mrs. Celia Parker Woolley in Chicago, Miss Ovington in New York. Miss Hancock, a busy, hopeful Quaker woman, has a broom squad of Negro boys which makes a regular business of sweeping several of the streets in the very worst slum district in Philadelphia. It gives them employment and it teaches them civic responsibility and pride. But perhaps I can give the best idea of these movements by telling of the different forms of work in a single city, Indianapolis. In the first place, the Flanner Guild, projected by Mr. Flanner, a white man, is maintained largely by white contributions, but it is controlled wholly by coloured people. Millinery classes were opened for girls, of which there are now many practicing graduates, 8 of whom are giving lessons in Indianapolis and in other cities. And there are clubs and social gatherings of all sorts. It has been, indeed, a helpful social center of influence. In the South, as I have shown, Negroes receive much offhand individual charity, food from the kitchen, gifts of old clothes and money. But it is largely personal and unorganized. In the North there is comparatively little indiscriminate giving, but an effort to reach and help Negro families by making them help themselves. One of the difficulties of the Negro is improvidence, but once given a start on the road to money saving, it is often astonishing to see him try to live up to cash in the bank. The Charity Organization Society of Indianapolis has long maintained a dime savings and loan association which employs 6 women collectors, 1 coloured, who visit hundreds of homes every week. These form indeed a corps of friendly visitors, the work of collecting the savings furnishing them an opportunity of getting into the homes and so winning the confidence of the people that they can help them in many ways. Last year over 6,000 depositors were registered in the association, 2/3 of whom were Negroes, and over $25,000 was on deposit. Not less than 25 cents a week is accepted, but many Negroes save much more. As soon as they get into the habit of saving, they usually transfer their accounts to the savings bank, and once with a bank book, they are on the road to genuine improvement. Another work of great value which Mr. Grout of the Charity Organization Society has organized is vacant lot cultivation. By securing the use of vacant land in and around the city, many Negro families have been encouraged to make gardens, thus furnishing healthful and self-respecting occupation for the old or very young members of many Negro families, who otherwise might become public charges. The plots are plowed and seeds are provided. The Negroes do their own work and take the crop. The work is supported by voluntary contributions from white people. A number of Negro women have raised enough vegetables not only to supply themselves, but have had some to sell. Negro children are closely looked after in Indianapolis. Compulsory education applies equally to both races. Every family thus comes also under the more or less active attention of the school authorities. An officer, Miss Sarah Colton Smith, is employed exclusively to visit and keep watch of the Negro children. Her work also is largely that of the friendly visitor, helping the various overworked mothers with suggestions, taking an interest in Negro organizations. For example, the Colored Woman's Club, working with Miss Smith, has organized a day nursery which cares for some of the very young children of working Negro women, thereby allowing the older ones to go to school. Indianapolis, which has one of the most progressive and intelligent school systems, wholly non-political, in the country, is also thoroughly alive to the necessity of industrial education, for both races. Significantly enough, the Negro schools were first fitted with industrial departments, so that for a time the cost of education per capita in Indianapolis was higher for coloured children than for white. When I expressed my surprise at this unusual condition, I was told, "Of course the immediate need of the Negro was greater." Night schools are also held in the public school buildings from November to April, 2 schools for Negroes especially, where coloured people of all ages are at liberty to attend. It is a remarkable sight. Negroes 50 and 60 years old mingle there with mere children. The girls are taught sewing and cooking, the men carpentry, besides the ordinary branches. One old man from the South was found crying with joy over his ability to write his name. For the very young children, Negro equally with white, there is Mrs. Eliza Blaker's kindergarten. For the aged coloured women a home is now supported principally by the coloured people themselves. End of Part 1 of Chapter 7. Part 2 of Chapter 7 of Following the Color Line, An Account of Negro Citizenship in the American Democracy, by Ray Stannard Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Morals of Negro Women. I saw a good deal of these various lines of activity and talked with the people who come close in touch with the struggling masses of the Negro poor. I wish I had room to tell some of the stories I heard. The black masses of poverty, disease, hopeless ignorance, and yet everywhere shot through with hopeful tendencies and individual uplift and success. In Indianapolis, as in other Northern cities, I heard much to the credit of the Negro women. "If the Negro is saved here in the North," Miss Smith told me, "it will be due to the women." They gave me many illustrations showing how hard the Negro women worked, taking in washing or going out every day to work, raising their families, keeping the home, sometimes supporting worthless husbands. "A Negro woman of the lower class," one visitor said to me, "rarely expects her husband to support her. She takes the whole burden herself." And the women, so the loan association visitors told me, are the chief savers. They are the ones who get and keep the bank accounts. I have heard a great deal South and North about the immorality of Negro women. Much immorality no doubt exists, but no honest observer can go into any of the crowded coloured communities of Northern cities and study the life without coming away with a new respect for the Negro women. Another hopeful work in Indianapolis is the juvenile court. A boy who commits a crime is not immediately cast off to become a more desperate criminal and ultimately to take his revenge upon the society which neglected him. He comes into a specially organized court, where he meets not violence but friendliness and encouragement. Mrs. Helen W. Rogers is at the head of the probation work in Indianapolis, and she has under her supervision a large corps of voluntary probation officers, 30 of whom are coloured men and women, the best in town. These coloured probation officers have an organization of which George W. Cable, who is the foreman of the distributing department of the Indianapolis Post Office, is the chairman. A Negro boy charged with an offense is turned over to one of these leading Negro men or women, required to report regularly, and helped until he gets on his feet again. Thus far the system has worked with great success. Boys whose offenses are too serious for probation are sent, not to jail or chain gang, where they become habitual criminals, but to a reform school, where they are taught regular habits of work. Why the Negro Often Fails. As I continued my inquiries, I found that the leading coloured men in most cities, though they might be ever so discouraged over the condition of the ignorant, reckless masses of their people, were awakening to the fact that the Negro's difficulty in the North was not all racial, not all due to mere colour prejudice, but also in large measure to lack of training, lack of aggressiveness and efficiency, lack of organization. In New York a Committee for Improving the Industrial Condition of Negroes has been formed. It is composed of both white and coloured men, and the secretary is S. R. Scottron, an able coloured man. The object of the committee is to study the condition of the Negroes in New York City, find out the causes of idleness, and try to help the Negro to better employment. This committee has experienced difficulty not so much in finding openings for Negroes as in getting reliable Negroes to fill them. Boys and girls, though educated in public schools, come out without knowing how to do anything that will earn them a living. Although the advantages of Cooper Institute and other industrial training schools are open to Negroes, they have been little used, either from lack of knowledge of the opportunity or because the Negroes preferred the regular literary courses of the schools. So many unskilled and untrained Negroes, both old and young, have discouraged many employers from trying any sort of Negro help. I shall not forget the significant remark of a white employer I met in Indianapolis, a broad gauge man known for his philanthropies. "I've tried Negro help over and over again, hoping to help out the condition of Negro idleness we have here. I have had 2 or 3 good Negro workers, but so many of them have been wholly undisciplined, irresponsible, and sometimes actually dishonest, that I've given up trying. When I hear that an applicant is coloured, I don't employ him." Upon this very point Professor Bulkley said to me, "The great need of the young coloured people is practical training in industry. A Negro boy can't expect to get hold in a trade unless he has had training." R. R. Wright, Jr., who has made a study of conditions in Philadelphia, says: "It is in the skilled trades that the Negroes are at the greatest disadvantage. Negroes have been largely shut out of mechanical trades, partly because of indifference and occasional active hostility of labour unions, partly because it has been difficult to overcome the traditional notion that a Negro's place is in domestic service, but chiefly because there have been practically no opportunities for Negroes to learn trades. Those Negroes who know skilled trades and follow them are principally men from the South, who learn their trades there. The poorest of them fall into domestic service, the best have found places at their trades. For the Negro boy who is born in this city it is difficult to acquire a trade, and here, I say, the system has been weakest." With the idea of giving more practical training, School No. 80 in New York, of which Professor Bulkley is principal, is now opened in the evenings for industrial instruction. Last year 1,300 coloured people, young and old, were registered. In short, there is a recognition in the North as in the South of the need of training the Negro to work. And not only the Negro, but the white boy and girl as well, as Germany and other European countries have learned. The Road from Slavery to Freedom. At Indianapolis I found an organization of Negro women called the Woman's Improvement Club. The president, Mrs. Lillian T. Fox, told me what the club was doing to solve the problem of the coloured girl and boy who could not get work. She found that, after all, white prejudice was not so much a bugaboo as she had imagined. The newspapers gave publicity to the work. The Commercial Club, the foremost business men's organization of the city, offered to lend its assistance. Several white employers agreed to try coloured help, and one, the Van Camp Packing Company, one of the great concerns of its kind in the country, even fitted up a new plant to be operated wholly by coloured people. Last fall, after the season's work was over, one of the officers of the company told me that the Negro plant had been a great success, that the girls had done their work faithfully and with great intelligence. Just recently a meeting of coloured carpenters was held in New York to organize for self-help, and they found that, by bringing pressure to bear, the Brotherhood of Carpenters was perfectly willing to accept them as members of the union on exactly the same basis as any other carpenters. In short, the Negro is beginning to awaken to the fact that if he is to survive and succeed in Northern cities, it must be by his own skill, energy, and organization. For, like any individual or any race, striving for a place in industry or in modern commercial life, the Negro must, in order to succeed, not only equal his competitor, but become more efficient. A Negro contractor said to me: "Yes, I can get any amount of work, but they expect me to do it a little better and a little cheaper than my white competitors." Then he added, "And I can do it, too." Those are the only terms on which success can be won. For so long a time the Negro has been driven or forced to work, as in the South, that he learns only slowly in an intense impersonal competitive life like that of the North, where work is at a premium, that he himself, not the white man, must do the driving. It is the lesson that raises any man from slavery into freedom. Pullman porters. So much for industry. The Negro in the North has also been going into business, and into other and varied employment. The very difficulty of getting hold in the trades and in salaried employment has driven many coloured people into small business enterprises: grocery stores, tailor shops, real estate or renting agencies. If they are being driven out by white men as waiters and barbers, they enjoy, on the other hand, growing opportunities as railroad and Pullman porters and waiters, places which are often highly profitable and lead, if the Negro saves his money, to better openings. A Negro banker whom I met in the South told me that he got his start as a Pullman porter. He had a good run, and by being active and accommodating, often made from $150 to $200 a month from his wages and tips. But the same change is going on in the North that I found everywhere in the South. I mean a growing race consciousness among Negroes, the building up of a more or less independent Negro community life within the greater white civilization. Every force seems to be working in that direction. Business among Boston and Philadelphia Negroes. As I have showed, many Negroes in Boston, and indeed in other cities, have made a success in business enterprises which are patronized by white people, or rather by both races. Coloured doctors and lawyers in Boston have more or less white practice. Of course, coloured men who can succeed without reference to their colour and do business with both races wish to continue to do so. But the tendency in the North, as in the South, is all against such development and toward Negro enterprises for the Negro population. Even in Boston, numerous enterprises are conducted by Negroes for Negroes. I visited several small but prosperous grocery stores. A Negro named Basil F. Hutchins has built up a thriving undertaking and livery establishment for Negro trade. Charles W. Alexander has a print shop with coloured workmen and publishes Alexander's Magazine. A new hotel called the Astor House, conducted by Negroes for Negroes, has 250 rooms with telephone service in each room, a large restaurant, and many of the other attractions of a good hotel. But in this growth the North is far behind the South. Scores of Negro banks are to be found in the South, not one in the North. Cities like Richmond, Virginia, Jackson, Mississippi, Nashville, Tennessee, have a really remarkable development of Negro business enterprises. Perhaps I can convey a clearer idea of the great variety of employment of Negroes in Northern cities by outlining the condition in a single city, Philadelphia, information for which I am indebted to R. R. Wright, Jr. The census of 1900 shows that out of 28,940 Negro males, boys and men, 21,128 were at work, and out of 33,673 girls and women, 14,095 were wage earners. Here are some of the more numerous occupations of Negro men. Common laborers, 7,690. Servants and waiters, 4,378. Teamsters and hackmen, 1,957. Porters and helpers in stores, 921. Barbers and hairdressers, 444. Messengers and errand boys, 346. Brick and stone masons, 308. Most of these are, of course, low-class occupations, the hard wage work of the city in which the men often sink below the poverty line. On the other hand, the census gives these figures: Negro professional men, 415, and women, 170, including doctors, clergymen, dentists, teachers, electricians, architects, artists, musicians, lawyers, journalists, civil engineers, actors, literary and scientific persons, etc., 585. Retail merchants, men, 297, women, 22, 319. Hotel keepers, 13. One Negro runs a men's furnishing store, another a drug store, others groceries, meats, etc. The beneficial society has grown to a regular insurance company, the renting agent has become a real estate dealer. Within the past 12 months, Negroes have incorporated 2 realty companies, 1 land investment company, 4 building and loan associations, 1 manufacturing company, 1 insurance company, besides a number of other smaller concerns. The civil service has proved of advantage to the Negro of Philadelphia, as of every other large Northern city. In the post office there are about 150 clerks, carriers, and other employees, on the police force about 70 patrolmen, and 40 school teachers, and about 200 persons in other municipal offices. Wherein lies success for Negroes? I have thus endeavored to present the conditions of the Negro in the North, and show his relationship with white people. I have tried to exhibit every factor, good or bad, which plays a part in racial conditions. Many sinister influences exist. The large increase of ignorant and unskilled Negroes from the South, the growing prejudice in the North, both social and industrial, against the Negro, the high death rate and low birth rate among the Negro population, which is due to poverty, ignorance, crime, and an unfriendly climate. On the other hand, many encouraging and hopeful tendencies are perceptible. Individual Negroes are forcing recognition in nearly all branches of human activity, entering business life and the professions. A new racial consciousness is growing up leading to organizations for self-help, and while white prejudice is increasing, so is white helpfulness as manifested in social settlements, industrial schools, and other useful philanthropies. All these forces and counterforces, economic, social, religious, political, are at work. We can all see them plainly, but we cannot judge of their respective strength. It is a tremendous struggle that is going on, the struggle of a backward race for survival within the swift moving civilization of an advanced race. No one can look upon it without the most profound fascination for its interests as a human spectacle, nor without the deepest sympathy for the efforts of 10,000,000 human beings to surmount the obstacles which beset them on every hand. And what a struggle it is! As I look upon it and see this dark horde of men and women coming up, a few white men here and there cheering them on, a few bitterly holding them back, I feel that Port Arthur and the Battle of Manchuria, bloody as they were, are not to be compared with such a conflict as this, for this is the silent, dogged, sanguinary, modern struggle in which the combatants never rest upon their arms. But the object is much the same: the effort of a backward race for a foothold upon this earth, for civilized respect and an opportunity to expand. And the Negro is not fighting Russians, but Americans, Germans, Irish, English, Italians, Jews, Slavs, all those mingling white races, each indeed engaged in the same sort of a struggle, which make up the nation we call America. The more I see of the conflict, the more I seem to see that victory or defeat lies with the Negro himself. As a wise Negro put it to me, "40 years ago the white man emancipated us, but we are only just now discovering that we must emancipate ourselves." Whether the Negro can survive the conflict, how it will all come out, no man knows. For this is the making of life itself. End of chapter 7. End of part 2. The Negro in the North.